California is often imagined as a land of golden beaches, Hollywood stars, and one of the largest economies in the world. In fact, if California were its own country, its economy would rank among the biggest on the planet. But long before it became the powerhouse we know today, the region experienced thousands of years of fascinating history, shaped by indigenous cultures, European exploration, and colonial ambitions. The story of California begins thousands of years before modern borders existed. Historians believe that humans first arrived in what is now California, around 10,000 BC. These early inhabitants likely migrated from Asia, traveling across the Bering Land Bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska during the Ice Age. Over time, these early migrants spread southward and gradually settled across the vast and diverse landscapes of California. As centuries passed, these communities developed into many different Native American tribes. By the time Europeans first arrived, more than 100 distinct tribes lived throughout the region. Each tribe had its own language, traditions, and way of life. Some tribes lived near the coast and depended heavily on fishing and gathering shellfish. Others settled in forests or valleys where hunting and plant gathering sustained their communities. The geography of California, from mountains and deserts to rivers and coastlines, allowed these cultures to flourish in unique ways. Population estimates vary, but historians believe that somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Native Americans lived in California before European contact. For thousands of years, these communities thrived, building complex societies deeply connected to the land. That long period of independence would eventually change with the arrival of European explorers. The first known European to reach California's coastline was Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, a Spanish explorer. In 1542, Cabrillo led an expedition sailing north from what is now Mexico, which at the time was part of the Spanish colonial territory known as New Spain. During his voyage, Cabrillo and his crew explored parts of the California coastline and eventually arrived at San Diego Bay. This marked the first recorded European landing in the region. However, Cabrillo's expedition did not lead to immediate colonization. Spain was primarily searching for valuable resources and strategic trade routes. Since the explorers did not discover large amounts of gold or other obvious riches, the Spanish crown saw little reason to establish settlements there at the time. For several decades after Cabrillo's voyage, California remained largely untouched by European powers. Occasionally, ships passed by the coast. Spanish traders traveling between Asia and Mexico sometimes stopped along the shoreline. English explorers also appeared in the region from time to time. One of the most famous of these visitors was Sir Francis Drake, who sailed along parts of the California coast during his global expedition in the late 1500s. Drake even claimed the land for England, naming it Nova Albion. But despite this claim, no permanent English settlement was ever established there. As a result, California continued to exist mostly outside of European control. Another major Spanish expedition arrived in 1602, led by explorer Sebastián Vizcaíno. His mission was to map the coastline and evaluate whether the region could support Spanish settlements. Vizcaíno explored important areas such as San Diego Bay and Monterey Bay, carefully documenting their harbors and natural features. His reports described Monterey as a particularly promising location for future colonization. Yet despite these favorable reports, Spain still did not immediately establish settlements. The region was distant, difficult to reach, and not considered economically essential compared to Spain's other colonies. For decades, California remained a remote and largely ignored territory. Everything began to change in the late 1700s. At this time, Spain grew increasingly concerned about the presence of other European powers along the Pacific coast. Russia had begun expanding southward from Alaska, and Britain was also exploring the region. To protect its claims, Spain finally decided to establish a permanent presence in California. This northern frontier of New Spain became known as Alta California. Beginning in 1769, Spanish missionaries and soldiers started building a chain of religious and military settlements along the California coast. The first mission and military fort were established near present-day San Diego. These early settlements were part of a larger effort led by Franciscan missionaries, whose goal was to spread Christianity among the indigenous population, while also strengthening Spain's political control of the region. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in California's history, one that would reshape the land, its people, and its future forever. But the relationship between Spanish colonizers and the Native American communities was far from simple, and the system of missions that soon spread across California would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. When Spain finally decided to establish a permanent presence in Alta California in the late 1700s, its plan relied heavily on a network of missions, military forts, and small civilian towns. These settlements were meant to secure Spain's claim to the region while also spreading Christianity among the indigenous population. The mission system became the backbone of Spanish California. Beginning in 1769, Franciscan missionaries started building a chain of religious settlements stretching along the California coastline. Over time, more than 20 missions were established, forming a long corridor of Spanish influence from San Diego in the south to the northern regions of the territory. Each mission served several purposes. It was a religious center where missionaries attempted to convert Native Americans to Christianity. It was also an agricultural community where crops and livestock were raised to support the growing colonial population. Alongside the missions, the Spanish government also built presidios, or military forts, to defend the territory. Small civilian towns known as pueblos were created as well, encouraging settlers to establish permanent communities. Some of the places that began as Spanish settlements later grew into major cities. Locations such as Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, Monterey, and Santa Cruz all trace their origins back to this early period of colonization. However, life in Alta California was far from easy. The region was extremely remote compared to Spain's other colonies in the Americas. Supplies from Mexico were often delayed or limited, which meant settlers and missionaries frequently struggled with shortages of food, tools, and other necessities. Disease outbreaks were also common, making life difficult for both the colonists and the indigenous communities living near the missions. The relationship between the Spanish and the Native American population was particularly complicated. Missionaries believed they were bringing religion, education, and European culture to the indigenous people. However, the mission system also forced many Native Americans to abandon their traditional lifestyles. Once converted, many indigenous people were expected to live at the missions and work in agriculture, construction, and other labor. In many cases, this labor was unpaid and tightly controlled. Native communities that had once freely lived across large areas of land were now confined to smaller spaces around the missions. These changes created tension and resentment. Several Native American groups organized rebellions and attacks against Spanish settlements. Some missions were damaged or destroyed during these uprisings, while other conflicts broke out between indigenous groups and Spanish soldiers. Because of these difficulties and the region's isolation, there were moments when Spanish authorities even considered abandoning Alta California entirely. Despite the challenges, Spain continued expanding its presence in the territory. Exploration of the northern coastline revealed more harbors and potential settlement areas. One particularly important discovery happened somewhat by accident. While searching for the harbor described decades earlier by Sebastian Vizcaino, explorers sailed past their intended destination and instead discovered the magnificent natural harbor that would later become San Francisco Bay. This discovery would eventually lead to the establishment of another major settlement and military outpost. Throughout the late 1700s and early 18th century, the Spanish continued adding missions, presidios, and pueblos across Alta California. Slowly but steadily, their colonial system took root in the region. But Spain's control over California would not last forever. In 1821, a major political transformation took place in North America. After years of conflict, Mexico gained independence from Spain, bringing an end to Spanish colonial rule in the region. When Mexico became an independent nation, Alta California automatically became a Mexican territory. This transition brought important changes to California society. The new Mexican government had different priorities than the Spanish crown. Instead of focusing primarily on religious missions, Mexico encouraged economic development and trade. One of the most significant shifts was the gradual decline of the mission system. By the 1830s, the Mexican government decided to secularize the missions, meaning that the church would lose control over them. Large portions of mission land were redistributed or converted into ranchos, large ranch estates primarily used for raising cattle. This change created a new social structure. powerful landowners, often known as Californios, began controlling vast stretches of land. Cattle ranching became the dominant economic activity, and California developed a growing trade network focused on hides, leather, and agricultural goods. At the same time, California began attracting foreign settlers. Because Mexico opened the territory to international trade and immigration, more people started arriving from the United States and Europe. Many Americans moved westward in search of land and economic opportunity. Gradually, the number of American settlers in California began to grow. Meanwhile, the indigenous population continued to decline due to disease, displacement, and the lasting effects of the mission system. By the early 1840s, California had become a complex and rapidly changing frontier society. Mexican authorities still officially controlled the territory, but American settlers were becoming more numerous and influential. This growing imbalance would soon lead to political instability. Within just a few years, tensions between Mexican authorities and American settlers would explode into a short-lived rebellion, one that would briefly create an independent nation known as the California Republic. And that dramatic moment would soon pull California directly into a much larger conflict between Mexico and the United States. By the early 1840s, California was still officially a territory of Mexico, but the situation on the ground was rapidly changing. American settlers were arriving in increasing numbers, drawn by the promise of land, trade opportunities, and the expanding frontier of the United States. As more Americans moved into the region, tensions began to rise between them and the Mexican authorities who governed California. Communication between California and Mexico City was slow and difficult, and the Mexican government struggled to maintain strong control over such a distant territory. At the same time, the United States had begun expanding westward under the idea known as manifest destiny, the belief that the nation was destined to spread across the North American continent. These pressures eventually led to a dramatic turning point in California's history. In the summer of 1846, a small group of American settlers in Northern California launched an uprising against Mexican rule. This event would later become known as the Bear Flag Revolt. On June 14, 1846, the rebels captured the small town of Sonoma, which was an important Mexican military outpost. After seizing control of the town, the group raised a homemade flag featuring a bear and a single star. With this act, the rebels declared the creation of an independent nation called the California Republic. Although the new republic had an ambitious name, it was actually very short-lived. The rebellion lasted only about a month. The reason for its quick end was that a much larger conflict was already underway. 2 months earlier, the United States had declared war on Mexico, beginning the Mexican-American War. When American military forces reached California, they quickly took control of key settlements, including Monterrey, which had been the capital of Mexican California. When the Bear Flag rebels learned that the United States had already claimed the region during the war, they faced an important decision. They could attempt to defend their independence against another powerful country, or they could accept American authority. Since many of the rebels had originally hoped that California would eventually become part of the United States, the choice was relatively simple. The California Republic ended almost as quickly as it had begun, and the territory soon came under full American military control. The war between the United States and Mexico continued for nearly 2 years. Finally, on February 2, 1848, the conflict officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Under the terms of the treaty, Mexico agreed to give up a large portion of its northern territories, including California, to the United States. California was now officially American land. But an extraordinary discovery was about to change everything. Just days before the treaty was signed, a carpenter named James W. Marshall was working at a sawmill along the American River, near a small settlement called Coloma. The mill belonged to a Swiss immigrant named John Sutter. On January 24, 1848, Marshall noticed something shiny in the water flowing through the mill's construction channel. After examining the metal more closely, he realized that it was gold. At first, the discovery was kept relatively quiet. Marshall and Sutter hoped to keep the news secret while they secured the land and mining rights for themselves. However, secrets like this rarely stay hidden for long. Within months, word of the discovery spread across California and eventually across the entire world. By 1849, thousands of people were rushing toward California in hopes of striking it rich. These fortune seekers became famously known as the 49ers. The gold rush triggered one of the largest migrations in American history. People traveled from every direction. Some came from other parts of the United States, crossing dangerous mountain trails or sailing around South America to reach California's ports. Others arrived from distant countries such as Mexico, China, Chile, Australia, and many European nations. Almost overnight, California transformed from a quiet frontier territory into a booming center of activity. Mining camps, trading posts, and small towns appeared across Northern California wherever gold was discovered. Entrepreneurs opened businesses to sell tools, food, clothing, and equipment to the miners. In many cases, merchants and shop owners made even more money than the miners themselves. The population of California exploded. Within just a few years, the number of people living in the territory increased dramatically. Between 1850 and 1859, miners extracted an estimated 28 million ounces of gold from California's rivers and hills. This massive influx of wealth and population rapidly accelerated the development of the region. Roads, businesses, and infrastructure expanded quickly to support the growing economy. The gold rush also played a major role in California's political future. Because of its sudden population boom, California was able to apply for statehood much faster than most territories. In 1850, only 2 years after gold was discovered, California officially became the 31st state of the United States. The once quiet frontier had now become one of the fastest growing and most important regions in the country. However, while many newcomers found opportunity and prosperity during this time, the gold rush also brought devastating consequences for California's Native American communities. And as California continued to grow during the late 19th century, the state would face new challenges, tragedies, and transformations that would shape the modern California we recognize today. By the time California officially became the 31st state of the United States in 1850, it had already changed dramatically. The discovery of gold had transformed what was once a quiet frontier into one of the most dynamic and rapidly growing regions in North America. But while many settlers found wealth and opportunity, the story was very different for the Native American communities who had lived on this land for thousands of years. During and after the gold rush, Native Californians faced severe hardships. Violence, forced displacement, and the spread of diseases drastically reduced their population. Many indigenous groups were pushed off their ancestral lands and eventually confined to small reservations created by the U.S. government. By the late 1800s, the once thriving native population had declined sharply. Despite these tragic consequences, California continued to expand and develop at an incredible pace. After the gold rush slowed down in the late 1850s, California began building a more stable economy. Agriculture quickly became one of the state's most important industries. The fertile valleys of California proved perfect for growing crops such as wheat, fruits, and vegetables. Over time, the state would become one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world. At the same time, transportation and infrastructure were rapidly improving. One of the most important developments was the expansion of the railroad system. In the late 1800s, new railway lines connected California with the eastern United States. These railroads allowed goods, resources, and people to travel across the country much more quickly than before. The connection to the national rail network strengthened California's economy and encouraged even more migration to the state. Cities began growing rapidly as businesses, farms, and industries expanded. By the early 20th century, California had already become an important part of the American economy. However, the state soon faced one of the most devastating disasters in its history. On April 18, 1906, a massive earthquake struck San Francisco. The earthquake and the fires that followed caused catastrophic damage across the city. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed and thousands of buildings collapsed or burned. More than 250,000 people were left homeless, and modern estimates suggest that around 3,000 people lost their lives. The disaster shocked the nation, but it also demonstrated California's resilience. In the years that followed, San Francisco was rebuilt and continued to grow into one of the most influential cities on the West Coast. Just a few decades later, the United States entered another difficult period known as the Great Depression during the 1930s. During this time, severe droughts and dust storms devastated farmland across the central United States. These environmental disasters became known as the Dust Bowl. Thousands of struggling families from states like Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas were forced to leave their homes in search of better opportunities. Many of these migrants traveled west to California. Although life was still difficult, California offered agricultural jobs and the possibility of a fresh start. Large numbers of families settled in the state's farming regions, adding to the growing population. Then, during the 1940s, another major event reshaped California's economy: World War II. The war created enormous demand for ships, aircraft, and military equipment. California's coastal cities became major centers for wartime manufacturing. Shipyards, aircraft factories, and military bases provided jobs for hundreds of thousands of people. As soldiers returned home after the war, many chose to settle permanently in California. The state's warm climate, expanding industries, and economic opportunities made it an attractive place to live. During the following decades, California continued to evolve. By the 1960s, California had become the most populous state in the United States, a title it still holds today. The state also played an important role in major cultural and social movements that influenced the entire country. Civil rights activism, student protests, and cultural revolutions all had strong roots in California during this period. In 1969, Native American activists famously occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, drawing national attention to indigenous rights and historical injustices. California also became the global center of several major industries. Hollywood turned Los Angeles into the heart of the world's film and entertainment industry. Silicon Valley emerged as the birthplace of technological innovation, producing companies that would transform the digital age. Today, California stands as one of the most influential regions on Earth. Its economy is larger than that of most countries. Its culture shapes global trends in entertainment, technology, and lifestyle. Its diverse population represents people from every corner of the world. But behind California's modern success lies a long and complex history. From the ancient Native American civilizations that first called this land home, to Spanish missions and Mexican rule, to a short-lived republic, the gold rush, and eventual statehood. Each chapter played a role in shaping the California we know today. It is a land built by exploration, ambition, struggle, and transformation. And understanding that history helps us appreciate how this remarkable place became one of the most powerful and influential states in the modern world.